I was in the room that night. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I have worked in this industry for 31 years. I have been on sets with men who carried real weight, men whose names you know, men whose names history kept. And in all those years, across all those sets, across all those rooms, I never saw anything like what I saw that night in November 1972 in a private dining room on the 4th floor of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles. Bruce Lee was 32 years old. He was sitting at a table with 4 other men. He was not the biggest man in the room. He was not the loudest. He was wearing a dark suit and a red tie, and he was eating quietly and listening more than he was talking. That was something people did not know about Bruce Lee. They expected fire. They expected the man from the screen. What they got in private was someone who watched everything and said very little. Clint Eastwood was also in that room. He came in at 9:14. I remember the time because I'd just looked at my watch. He was wearing a beige coat over a grey suit. He was 42 years old that year, and he carried himself the way men carry themselves when they have never once in their lives doubted whether they belonged somewhere. He did not look around when he entered. He walked directly to the bar on the far side of the room, ordered something without looking at the menu, and stood with his back to the wall. For 11 minutes, the 2 men did not acknowledge each other. I noticed it because everyone else in the room noticed it. There was a particular quality to the air between them. Not hostility exactly, something older than hostility, the kind of tension that exists between 2 forces that have never occupied the same space before and are not yet sure what that means. Then Clint Eastwood picked up his glass and walked to Bruce Lee's table. He did not ask permission to sit. He pulled out the chair across from Bruce and sat down and placed his glass on the table and looked at Bruce Lee for a long moment without speaking. Bruce looked back at him. Neither man smiled. What Eastwood said next, I heard it clearly because the room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something important is about to happen. He said, "I've been watching you. You move like you think you're untouchable." Bruce Lee did not answer immediately. He picked up his glass. He took one small sip. He set it back down with the kind of precision that is not accidental. Then he looked at Clint Eastwood and said 7 words that I have never forgotten. "I don't think it. I know it." What happened in the next 4 hours in that hotel, and later in a basement 2 blocks away that smelled of cigarette smoke and cold concrete, would never be reported. No camera captured it. No journalist was present for the part that mattered. What exists are the memories of 6 people who are in that room and a single photograph that has passed quietly between them for 50 years. I am one of those 6 people, and I'm telling you this now because Bruce Lee has been gone for 50 years, and the story that was told about him, the clean story, the legend story, is missing the night that shaped everything that came after it. This is not the story you know. To understand what happened between Bruce Lee and Clint Eastwood in November 1972, you have to understand what both men were carrying into that room. Not their careers, not their reputations. What they were carrying inside, the weight that does not show up in interviews, that does not appear in biographies, that only becomes visible in the moments when a man is pushed past the boundary of what he is prepared for. Bruce Lee in the autumn of 1972 was at the edge of something enormous and something terrifying at the same time. Enter the Dragon was not yet finished. The film that would make him the most recognized face on the planet was still being assembled in an editing room in Hong Kong. He did not know yet what it would become. What he knew was that he had given everything he had to it, every hour, every idea, every physical resource his body possessed. He had lost 4 kilograms during the shoot. His right hand had a stress fracture that had not fully healed. He was sleeping 4 hours a night and telling no one. He had flown to Los Angeles 3 days earlier for a meeting with Warner Brothers that had lasted 40 minutes and resolved nothing. He was 32 years old, and he was burning at both ends, and the only person in the world who knew how close to empty he was running was his wife Linda, who was 7,000 miles away in Hong Kong putting their children to bed. That was the man who sat across from Clint Eastwood that night. That was the man Eastwood looked at and said, "You move like you think you're untouchable." And that was the night everything changed. Clint Eastwood had not always been the man the world thought he knew. This is important, because what happened between him and Bruce Lee that night did not come from nowhere. It came from somewhere specific. It came from a history that Eastwood had spent 20 years building a wall around, and that wall, on the night of November 1972, had one crack in it. One small crack that Bruce Lee, without knowing it, had put his finger directly on. Eastwood had grown up poor in Oakland, California. Not the kind of poor that gets romanticized in memoirs. The kind of poor where your father works 3 jobs and your mother counts coins on the kitchen table on Friday nights, and you learn very early that the world does not owe you anything, and that if you want something, you take it with both hands or you do not get it at all. He had been a gas station attendant. He had been a lumberjack. He had been a swimming pool digger in the California heat before anyone in Hollywood knew his name. He had clawed his way up with his hands, and by 1972 he was one of the most powerful men in American cinema. Dirty Harry had come out the previous year. The Dollars trilogy had made him a myth in Europe before America caught up. He was not simply an actor anymore. He was a symbol. He was what American masculinity looked like when it was compressed into one body and pointed at the world. But there was something underneath all of that. Something that his director friends knew and his co-stars suspected and his 2 ex-wives understood better than anyone. Clint Eastwood had a terror, not of failure, not of poverty, not of death. His terror was simpler and deeper than any of those. His terror was of being seen through, of someone looking at the myth and finding the gas station attendant underneath, of someone standing across from everything he had built and not blinking. Bruce Lee did not blink. That was the problem. That was the specific and precise problem that had been building since Eastwood walked into that dining room and saw Bruce Lee sitting quietly at his table, eating, and not performing for anyone in the room. Eastwood had expected the screen version. He had seen the clips. He had heard the stories from people who had been on set with him. He had prepared, in the way powerful men prepare, for a version of Bruce Lee he could manage. What he found was something he could not categorize. Bruce Lee in that room was absolutely still, not the stillness of someone suppressing energy, the stillness of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone in that building. Eastwood understood power. He had spent his entire life studying it, performing it, accumulating it, and he recognized in the 11 minutes before he walked to that table that what Bruce Lee had was not the same thing he had. It was older, it was quieter, it did not need the room. That recognition, that specific unwanted recognition, was what drove Eastwood across the room. Not aggression, not dominance, something closer to the feeling a man gets when he sees something he does not understand and cannot walk away from. He sat down, he looked at Bruce Lee, and he said the thing that had been forming in his chest since he walked in the door. "I've been watching you. You move like you think you're untouchable." He meant it as a challenge. He had used that tone before. He knew exactly what it did to people. It created a choice. Either defend yourself, which puts you on the back foot, or ignore it, which looks like weakness. It was a surgical instrument. He had used it on directors, on producers, on men twice his size on sets in Spain and Italy and the California desert. Bruce Lee looked at him and said 7 words. "I don't think it. I know it." And Clint Eastwood felt something he had not felt since he was 19 years old, standing in front of a foreman at a lumberyard in Eureka who had looked at him the same way, like the answer to every question had already been decided before the question was asked. He felt small, not physically, not professionally, something below all of that, something in the basement of himself that he had poured concrete over when he was 22 years old and told himself he would never go back to. For 3 seconds, Clint Eastwood did not speak. Those 3 seconds were noticed by everyone at the table, and in those 3 seconds, something shifted in the room that would not shift back. A door had opened, and through that door, in the next 4 hours, things would pass between these 2 men that neither of them had planned for, and neither of them would ever speak about publicly again. But before any of that happened, something else had to happen first. A third man had to walk into the room. His name was Raymond Chow. Not many people outside the film industry knew that name in 1972. Inside it, everyone knew it. Raymond Chow was the founder of Golden Harvest Studios in Hong Kong. He was the man who had looked at Bruce Lee when every other studio in Hollywood had looked away. He was the man who had signed Bruce Lee to a 2-picture deal when Warner Brothers was still trying to decide if a Chinese-American actor could carry a film that Western audiences would pay to see. He was 51 years old that night. He was wearing a dark grey suit. He carried a leather briefcase that he never opened in front of anyone he did not completely trust. He walked into the dining room at 9:47, and he saw immediately what was happening at Bruce Lee's table, and his face did not change at all. That was the thing about Raymond Chow. His face never changed. I had worked with him on 3 productions. I had seen him receive news that would have broken other men. Budgets collapsed, distribution deals fallen through, a lead actor hospitalized 2 days before principal photography. His face in every one of those moments was the same, quiet, attending, like a man reading a map in a language only he could understand. He walked to the table and sat down next to Bruce Lee. He did not acknowledge Clint Eastwood for 11 seconds. I counted. I was watching from across the room because I had understood by then that something was happening that I would want to remember. Raymond Chow placed his briefcase on the floor beside his chair, straightened his jacket, and then turned to Eastwood with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. He said, "Mr. Eastwood, I have wanted to meet you for some time." Eastwood looked at him. Something shifted in his posture. Not much. Enough. Because Raymond Chow was not what Eastwood had prepared for either. He had prepared for Bruce Lee. He had categorized Bruce Lee, incorrectly, as it turned out. But he had a category. Raymond Chow did not fit any category Eastwood had available. He was too calm. He was too certain. He had walked into a charged room and immediately changed its temperature without raising his voice or adjusting his expression by a single degree. Eastwood said, "Same." One word. It was a retreat. Everyone at the table felt it. Bruce Lee felt it. I could see it in the way his right hand, which had been resting flat on the table, moved almost imperceptibly, just the fingers curling once and then flattening again. It was the smallest gesture I have ever seen carry that much information. He knew what Raymond Chow had done. He knew why he had done it. And something in that knowing settled into his face like a man who has just been reminded of something he already understood. The 3 of them sat at that table for 40 minutes. I was not close enough to hear everything. What I heard in fragments. The way you hear things in a crowded room when the noise drops for a moment and a sentence reaches you whole before the noise comes back. What I heard was enough. Clint Eastwood wanted something from Bruce Lee. Not a fight, not a confrontation. Something more specific and more dangerous than either of those things. He wanted what Bruce Lee had. That quality of absolute self-certainty that Eastwood had recognized and could not name and could not manufacture no matter how many films he made or how many rooms he walked into with his shoulders back and his jaw set. He wanted to know where it came from. And Bruce Lee, who had grown up in Hong Kong and Seattle and had been beaten on the streets of both cities for being too Chinese in one and not Chinese enough in the other, Bruce Lee was not going to give that away for free. He was not going to give it away at all to a man who had opened the conversation the way Eastwood had opened it. But Raymond Chow understood something that neither Bruce nor Eastwood understood in that moment. He understood that what was happening at that table was not a conflict, it was a negotiation, and every negotiation, no matter how it begins, has a price. The question was never whether a deal could be made. The question was always what the deal would cost. At 10:37, Eastwood stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Bruce Lee for a long moment. Then he said something very quietly, so quietly that even Raymond Chow, sitting 18 inches away, had to lean forward slightly to hear it. I was across the room. I did not hear the words, but I saw Bruce Lee's face when he heard them. And I have spent 50 years trying to find the right words for what I saw there. I have to tell you about the basement. Not yet. First, I have to tell you what Bruce Lee's face looked like in that moment, because if I skip that, if I jump straight to the basement and the gun and the 4 minutes that changed everything, you will not understand what was at stake. You will see the surface of it. You will not see what was underneath. Bruce Lee's face, when Eastwood leaned down and said those quiet words, did something I'd never seen it do before. It went completely still. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing his reaction, not the performance of calm, something deeper, the kind of stillness that only arrives when something has reached a man at a level below thought, below training, below preparation, below every wall he has ever built, the kind of stillness that means the words landed somewhere real. I had been on set with Bruce Lee for 11 days at that point. I had watched him work. I had watched him fight. I had watched him move through a crowded room the way water moves, finding every space, never forcing, never stopping. I had seen him angry once, briefly, when a stunt coordinator tried to modify a sequence he had spent 3 weeks designing. The anger was cold and precise and over in 40 seconds, and afterward, the stunt coordinator did not try to modify anything again. I had never seen Bruce Lee look the way he looked in that moment. He looked like a man who had just been handed something he had not asked for and did not know yet whether it was a gift or a weapon. Eastwood left without looking back. The room exhaled. People who had been pretending not to watch went back to pretending to talk. Raymond Chow sat very still for a moment and then picked up his glass and finished what was in it in one slow movement. Bruce Lee sat without moving for perhaps 90 seconds. Then he turned to Raymond Chow and said something in Cantonese that I did not understand. Raymond Chow answered in 3 words. Bruce Lee nodded once. He pushed back his chair. He stood up. He straightened his jacket, the same precise, deliberate movement I had seen him make 100 times, and he walked toward the exit without stopping to speak to anyone. I followed him. I'm not sure why. Something in my chest again. He went down 2 floors in the elevator. He walked through the lobby without looking at anyone. He went through a side door that led to a service corridor, and from the service corridor down a stairwell and through a heavy door at the bottom that opened onto a parking structure below street level. I stayed at the top of the stairwell. I could see him through the small window in the door. He stood in that parking structure for a long time, just standing, not pacing, not on the phone, standing in the concrete quiet with his hands at his sides and his eyes on something that was not in the room. The fluorescent light above him flickered twice and then held. Somewhere in the structure a car door closed. He did not react to any of it. I watched him for 6 minutes. At the end of those 6 minutes, something happened that I have never told anyone. Not my wife, not my colleagues, no one. Because I did not have the language for it when it happened, and I'm not sure I have the language for it now. What I can tell you is what I saw. I cannot tell you what it meant. Bruce Lee raised his right hand. He held it out in front of him, palm facing down, fingers extended, completely level. He held it there for perhaps 10 seconds. His hand did not shake. It did not tremble. It was as still as stone. And then he closed it, slowly, finger by finger, into a fist so tight I could see the tendons in his wrist from where I stood. He held that fist for 5 seconds. Then he opened his hand again, completely open, completely flat. He turned and walked back toward the stairwell door. I moved away from the window quickly. I went back up the stairs. I was back at the table before he came through the dining room again. He sat down next to Raymond Chow. He picked up his glass. He drank. He said nothing about where he had been. 3 hours later, at 1:17 in the morning, Clint Eastwood walked back into that hotel. He was not alone. The man with him was someone I had never seen before. He was tall. He was wearing a dark overcoat. He carried nothing in his hands. He walked 2 steps behind Eastwood with the particular quality of movement that I had only ever seen in one other category of person. Men who had been trained specifically to hurt other men and had done it enough times that it no longer required their full attention. Bruce Lee saw them come through the door. He set down his glass very carefully. He did not stand up. The man in the dark overcoat had a name. I found it out 3 weeks later through a contact I had at a production company on Sunset Boulevard who knew people I did not know and asked questions I could not ask. His name was Carl Pruitt. He was 39 years old. He had spent 6 years in the United States Army, 2 of those years in places that were not officially acknowledged in any document that was available to the public. After the Army, he had done work, the specific nature of which nobody I spoke to would describe directly, for 3 different employers in 4 different cities between 1968 and 1971. By 1972, he was freelance. That was the word my contact used, freelance. He said it the way people say words when the word is doing more work than its surface meaning. The way you say a neighborhood is rough or a man is complicated. The word is true, but the truth it contains is larger than the word itself. Carl Pruitt sat down at the bar. He did not sit with Eastwood. He did not look at Bruce Lee. He ordered a glass of water, not a drink water, and he sat with his back straight and his hands on the bar and his eyes moving across the room in the slow, methodical pattern of a man who has been trained to know where every exit is before he needs one. Eastwood walked to Bruce Lee's table. He did not sit down this time. He stood. He put both hands in his coat pockets, and he looked down at Bruce Lee and Raymond Chow with an expression that had changed completely from what it had been 3 hours earlier. The uncertainty was gone. The crack that Bruce Lee had found in him, that specific human crack that had sent Eastwood across the room the first time, it had been sealed. What was there now was something harder and less complicated. He said, "I need 5 minutes, privately." Raymond Chow looked at Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee did not look at Raymond Chow. He was looking at Eastwood. He was doing the thing I had learned to recognize in 11 days, reading, not the man's words, the man himself, where his weight was, how he was breathing, what his hands were doing inside his coat pockets. Bruce Lee could extract more information from 30 seconds of observation than most people could from 30 minutes of conversation. What he extracted in those seconds I do not know. What I know is what he did. He stood up. He nodded once at Raymond Chow. A specific nod, the kind that means I know what I am doing, do not follow me. And he walked with Eastwood toward the far end of the room, where a short corridor led to a private function space that was empty and dark at that hour. I watched the corridor entrance for 4 minutes and 40 seconds. No sound came from it, no raised voices, nothing that would have drawn attention from anyone who was not already paying attention. 4 minutes and 40 seconds of complete silence from a darkened corridor where Bruce Lee and Clint Eastwood were alone together for the first and last time. When they came back out, everything was different. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself, but different in the way a room is different after the barometric pressure has changed. You cannot point to one specific thing that has shifted, but your body knows it before your mind catches up. Eastwood walked back toward the bar without looking at Bruce Lee. He said something quietly to Carl Pruitt. Pruitt stood up immediately and buttoned his coat, and they walked together toward the exit. At the door, Eastwood stopped. He turned. He looked back across the room at Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was standing exactly where he had been standing when they came out of the corridor. He had not moved. He was watching Eastwood with an expression that I have tried to describe to myself 100 times and never successfully. It was not defiance. It was not fear. It was not the stillness I had seen in the parking structure. It was something else entirely. It was the expression of a man who has just made a decision that he knows he cannot unmake. A door that only opens in one direction. The face of someone who has stepped through it and is now standing on the other side, looking back at where he was standing 30 seconds ago. Eastwood held that look for 3 seconds. Then he walked out. Bruce Lee sat back down. He picked up his glass. He looked at Raymond Chow and said one sentence. Raymond Chow listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he opened his briefcase, the first time I had seen him open it that night, and he took out a single sheet of paper and placed it on the table face down. He slid it across to Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee did not turn it over. Not yet. The paper stayed face down on the table for 7 minutes. I know it was 7 minutes because I watched the clock on the wall behind the bar. It was an ordinary clock. White face, black numbers, the kind you find in every hotel dining room in every city in the world. I had looked at it 100 times that night without registering it. Now, I could not stop looking at it. 7 minutes. Bruce Lee sat with that paper in front of him and did not touch it and did not look at it, and spoke to Raymond Chow about something I could not hear in a voice so quiet it barely moved the air between them. Raymond Chow listened. He did not offer opinions. He did not gesture. He sat with his hands folded on the table and his eyes on Bruce Lee's face, and he listened the way very few people know how to listen, completely, without preparing his next words, without his own thoughts running underneath. At the end of 7 minutes, Bruce Lee reached out and turned the paper over. He read it once. It took him 40 seconds. Then he placed it back on the table face up, and he sat back in his chair and he looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Not dramatically, not with visible emotion. The way a man looks at the ceiling when he is doing arithmetic in his head that has nothing to do with numbers. I could not see what was written on the paper from where I sat. I found out what was on it 2 years later. I will tell you what was on it. But first you need to understand what the 4 minutes and 40 seconds in that corridor had produced. Because the paper was not the beginning of what happened next. The corridor was the beginning. The paper was simply the corridor made visible on a page. What Clint Eastwood had said to Bruce Lee in that corridor, I learned it from Raymond Chow himself in a restaurant in Kowloon in the spring of 1974, 14 months after Bruce Lee was dead. Raymond Chow did not volunteer it. I asked him directly. He was quiet for a long time. He drank his tea, he set the cup down, he looked at the table, and then he told me. Eastwood had made Bruce Lee an offer. Not a film offer, not a professional proposition, something more personal and more dangerous than that. Eastwood had told Bruce Lee that there were men in Los Angeles, men with money and influence and the specific kind of patience that comes from never having had to hurry for anything in their lives, who had been watching Bruce Lee's rise very carefully, who had decided that his rise was moving too fast and in a direction they had not approved. He told Bruce Lee that these men had a preference. Their preference was that Enter the Dragon not be released in the United States in the form it was currently in, that certain sequences be removed, that the film's American distribution be restructured in a way that reduced Bruce Lee's prominence in the marketing, that Bruce Lee himself make certain public statements in the coming months that would reframe how American audiences understood what he represented. In exchange, these men would ensure that Bruce Lee's career in Hollywood continued and expanded without interference. If he declined, Eastwood had not finished that sentence. He had not needed to. He had simply looked at Bruce Lee in that dark corridor with Carl Pruitt waiting 30 feet away at the bar and let the unfinished sentence do what unfinished sentences do when the right person is delivering them in the right place at the right time. Bruce Lee had listened to all of it without speaking. When Eastwood finished, Bruce Lee was quiet for perhaps 15 seconds. Then he said, and this is Raymond Chow's recollection, word for word, because he asked Bruce about it the same night and Bruce repeated it to him exactly. Tell them I heard them. Tell them I said no. Tell them if they have something else to say to me, they know where I work. That was all. He walked back out into the dining room. He sat down. He waited 7 minutes. He turned over the paper. The paper contained one thing. It was not a threat. It was not a contract. It was a date. A specific date, written in the center of an otherwise blank page in Eastwood's handwriting. A date that was 7 months away from that November night in 1972. The date was June the 20th, 1973. Bruce Lee looked at that date on that page for a long time. Raymond Chow told me that when Bruce finally looked up from the paper, his face was completely calm, that he folded the paper carefully into quarters, that he put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, that he finished his drink, that he said goodnight to Raymond Chow in the same tone a man uses when he is leaving a dinner that went exactly as expected. He walked out of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel at 2:14 in the morning. He never walked out of a building again the same way. June the 20th, 1973. I want you to sit with that date for a moment before I tell you what it means. I want you to understand that when Raymond Chow slid that paper across the table, he already knew what the date meant. Bruce Lee already knew what the date meant. Every person in that hotel who understood anything about the film industry in 1972 would have known what that date meant the moment they saw it written on a page. June the 20th, 1973 was the scheduled American release date of Enter the Dragon. Not a coincidence. Not a general threat wrapped in ambiguity. A precise, surgical communication from men who knew exactly how the machinery worked and wanted Bruce Lee to understand that they knew. The date was not a warning about what might happen. It was a marker placed on a calendar by people who had already decided what would happen and were simply informing him of the timeline. Bruce Lee had folded that paper and put it in his jacket and walked out. In the weeks that followed, I watched him work. I was back in Hong Kong by the first week of December. The editing on Enter the Dragon was in its final stages. I was doing secondary camera work on a separate Golden Harvest production on the same lot, and I saw Bruce almost every day. I watched him in the editing room. I watched him in the corridor outside the editing room. I watched him on the studio floor when he came in to review finished sequences on the monitor. He did not look like a man who had received a threat. He looked like a man who had received information, specific, clarifying information that had settled something in him rather than disturbed it. There is a difference between those two things. A threat creates fear or anger or both. Information, the right kind of information delivered at the right moment, sometimes does the opposite. Sometimes it removes uncertainty. And uncertainty, for certain kinds of men, is harder to carry than danger. Bruce Lee, in December 1972, was the calmest I had ever seen him. He was sleeping better. His assistant told me this without being asked. She mentioned it the way people mention things that surprise them, as a piece of information she had not expected to have. He was eating regularly. The stress fracture in his hand that had not healed properly during the shoot had finally been seen by a specialist and was being treated correctly. He was spending more time with his children in the evenings instead of returning to the editing room after dinner. He had made his decision, and the decision had freed him. That was what I understood watching him those weeks. He had walked into that Beverly Wilshire dining room carrying the weight of a man who had given everything to something and did not yet know if the world would receive it. He had walked out carrying something different, not lighter exactly, differently distributed. The weight of a man who knows exactly what he is facing and has decided to face it anyway and has stopped spending energy on the question of whether to. There is a particular kind of freedom in that. Not many people find it. Most people, when they understand the size of what is against them, spend the rest of their available energy managing their fear of it. Bruce Lee had looked at what was against him, clearly, directly, without the softening of distance or denial, and had filed it somewhere useful and gone back to work. Enter the Dragon finished its final edit in January 1973. The film was everything Bruce Lee had said it would be, and more than anyone else had believed it could be. I saw a rough cut in a small screening room at Golden Harvest in the second week of January with 6 other people. I remember the silence in that room when it ended. Not the polite silence of people searching for compliments, the genuine silence of people who have just seen something they did not expect and have not yet processed what it means. Raymond Chow sat 2 seats to my left. When the lights came up, he sat without moving for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he turned to the man beside him, one of the American producers from Warner Brothers who had flown in for the screening, and he said 5 words very quietly. "They are going to come." He meant audiences. He meant the world. He was right. But in that small screening room in January 1973, something else was also true. Something that Raymond Chow knew and the Warner Brothers producer did not know, and I knew only because I had been in a hotel dining room in Los Angeles 6 weeks earlier, watching a man read a date on a piece of paper. The film that was going to bring the world to Bruce Lee was also the film that certain men had decided would never reach them. June the 20th was 5 months away, and somewhere in Los Angeles, in rooms I would never see and conversations I would never hear, a clock had started. Bruce Lee died on July the 20th, 1973, not June the 20th. July, 1 month after the date that had been written on that paper in Eastwood's handwriting and folded into quarters and placed in the inside pocket of a jacket on a November night in Los Angeles. 1 month after Enter the Dragon had opened in Hong Kong to audiences that had never seen anything like it. 1 month after the machinery that certain men had tried to stop had already started moving too fast for anyone to stop it. He was 32 years old. The official cause of death was cerebral edema, swelling of the brain. He was found unresponsive in the apartment of actress Betty Ting Pei in Kowloon. He had complained of a headache. He had taken a painkiller. He had lain down. He had not woken up. The doctors who examined him found that his brain had swollen to a degree that was not consistent with the painkiller he had taken. They found no other obvious cause. The coroner recorded a verdict of death by misadventure. The world accepted that verdict. I did not accept it. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say that. I'm not telling you that I have proof of something else. I'm not telling you that I know what happened in that apartment on July the 20th. What I'm telling you is that I was in a hotel dining room in Los Angeles in November 1972. I saw a man hand Bruce Lee a piece of paper with a date on it. I know what that date meant, and I know the people who chose that date understood exactly what they were communicating. I'm telling you that 1 month is a very specific distance. Raymond Chow did not speak publicly about Bruce Lee's death for many years. When he did speak, he said what the official record said. He was careful. He was always careful. But in Kowloon, in the spring of 1974, in that restaurant where he told me what had happened in the corridor of the Beverly Wilshire, he said one other thing that he did not say publicly and that I have carried with me for 50 years. I asked him if he believed the official verdict. He picked up his tea. He looked at it. He set it down without drinking. He said, "Bruce made enemies the way a fire makes smoke. You cannot have one without the other. And when the fire goes out, the people who are bothered by the smoke do not grieve." That was all he said. He did not elaborate. He did not name anyone. He finished his meal, and he paid, and he left, and I never spoke to him privately again about that night or about Bruce Lee's death. I have thought about those words for 50 years. What I keep coming back to is not the words themselves. It is the tea, the way he picked it up and looked at it and put it down without drinking. Raymond Chow was a man who completed his actions. I had watched him for years. He did not pick things up and put them down. He picked things up and used them and set them down when he was finished. The tea was the tell. Something in the question had reached him in a place he was not going to let me see. And so he picked up the tea and looked at it and set it down and answered in the only way he could answer and still leave that restaurant as the man he needed to be. Enter the Dragon opened in the United States on August the 19th, 1973. Bruce Lee had been dead for 30 days. The film made $11 million in its first week. It went on to gross $90 million worldwide against a production budget of $850,000. It made Bruce Lee the most recognized face on the planet. It did everything Raymond Chow had said it would do in that screening room in January. It brought the world to Bruce Lee exactly as he had known it would. He just was not there to receive it. Clint Eastwood never spoke publicly about Bruce Lee, not once in 50 years of interviews and profiles and retrospectives and documentaries. A man who spoke about almost everything, his films, his politics, his marriages, his failures, his age, never once mentioned the man he had sat across from in a Beverly Wilshire dining room in November 1972. Never once mentioned the 4 minutes and 40 seconds in a corridor. Never once mentioned a piece of paper with a date on it. That silence has a shape. I have learned in 31 years of working in this industry that silences have shapes the same way rooms have shapes. You can tell what was in a room by the shape of the empty space it left behind. Eastwood's silence about Bruce Lee is not the silence of someone who never knew him. It is not the silence of indifference or irrelevance. It is the silence of someone who knows exactly what he is not saying. I was behind the camera that night. I put my cigarette down. I cannot tell you why. Something in my chest told me to put it down, and I have never fully put it back.